a tremendous tariff on lumber and things as such. And yet we don't need their lumber. We have more lumber than they do. We don't need Canada's lumber.
Canada does not dump lumber into the United States. And we will continue to make the case that these current and proposed duties are unjustified.
Provide a little bit more lumber within their supply, but there's no way that they can replace the imports coming from.
When Donald Trump announced that the United States didn't need lumber or cars from Canada, many thought it was another round of political bravado. But then came the tariffs. Overnight, Washington framed Canadian lumber as a national security concern and taxed it heavily. Within days, markets convulsed. Prices shot upward, crossing $650 per thousand board feet, and the ripple hit home builders across the country. Construction costs ballooned and projects that once looked profitable began to stall. That one decision struck at the heart of America's housing system. Roughly a third of the lumber used in U.S. homes comes from abroad, and most of it originates in Canada. By taxing that lifeline, the administration had turned a policy move into a shockwave for the housing market. Builders hesitated. Home prices climbed beyond reach for countless families. Experts warned that every uptick in cost could lock millions out of owning a home altogether. What had started as an effort to boost domestic jobs was now reshaping the very foundation of American housing. Could a plan meant to strengthen the nation end up pushing it toward a deeper economic divide? Once the tariffs took hold, the numbers revealed an uncomfortable truth that political speeches had left out. Canada provides around 12 billion board feet of softwood lumber to the United States each year, roughly a quarter of what the country needs. Even if every sawmill in America ran nonstop, production would still fall short by more than 3 billion board feet. Analysts had warned for years that replacing Canada's role in the supply chain was not a short-term fix. Even under the best conditions with new mills, a full workforce, and heavy investment, it could take nearly a decade to make up the difference. And that projection assumes the U.S. could secure the resources and labor needed to expand production, something far from certain. Most American mills already operate near their limit, running at around 95% capacity while struggling with aging equipment and persistent worker shortages. Those limits became visible in every corner of the housing market. Costs for lumber climbed faster than wages, squeezing contractors and forcing builders to pay more for every frame and beam. The impact quickly rippled outward. Home prices rose, construction slowed. Families who once planned to buy found themselves priced out of the market. What began as a move to protect domestic jobs had turned into an obstacle for the broader economy. As each spike in lumber costs added weight to an already expensive housing system, the policy meant to secure American industry had triggered an inflationary wave that reached from job sites to household budgets. Independence from Canadian imports now looked less like strength and more like strain, revealing how deeply the two economies had become intertwined. While the U.S. wrestled with higher costs, Canada's leadership took a different approach. Instead of countering with retaliation, Prime Minister Mark Carney's government focused on adaptation. Ottawa unveiled a $500 million initiative aimed at helping lumber producers diversify their markets and reduce dependence on American buyers. Not long after another $1.22 billion package was rolled out to protect the industry from anti-dumping duties and to strengthen competitiveness abroad. British Columbia's Minister of Forests, Ravi Parmar, outlined an ambitious target: redirect at least 10% of lumber exports toward new global markets. This response was not about confrontation. It was about reinvention. Canadian officials framed the tariffs as a moment to rethink how their lumber industry could compete globally. Provinces like British Columbia and Alberta, long reliant on steady U.S. demand, became centers for modernization and new investment. The government poured resources into innovation grants, trade missions, and infrastructure improvements that would make exports faster and more efficient. What could have been a blow to confidence turned into a spark for change. As the United States tightened its trade barriers, Canada began expanding its network, strengthening its footing in a global marketplace eager for reliable suppliers. Over time, the contrast between the two neighbors became more visible. For decades, roughly 90% of Canadian lumber exports had gone straight to the American market. That dependence had seemed unshakable. But once the tariffs disrupted that flow, Canadian producers looked outward and found opportunity elsewhere. Shipments began heading to South Korea, Vietnam, India, Australia, the United Kingdom, and markets throughout the Middle East and North Africa. Japan, which had previously played a minor role in Canada's export strategy, increased its imports by about 26% in early 2024, a sign that international buyers saw stability where others saw risk. Trade deals with countries like Germany and South Korea followed, opening new paths for growth and reinforcing Canada's position as a sustainable, trusted partner in construction materials. Athomi, major forestry companies and port authorities in Vancouver and Prince Rupert invested heavily in modernization to handle the rise in overseas trade. Every shipment that left Canadian shores now symbolized more than commerce. It marked a shift in the country's economic identity. Canada was no longer defined by dependence on its southern neighbor. It was transforming into a confident global supplier, ready to compete in regions far beyond North America. Meanwhile, the United States was grappling with the unintended fallout of its policy. Across the housing industry, frustration mounted. Builders in states such as Texas, Ohio, and Florida reported delays and escalating budgets. Many construction projects slowed or stopped altogether. The National Association of Home Builders estimated that for every 1% increase in lumber costs, the price of a new home rose by is about $1,000. When prices surged towards $765 per thousand board feet, the result was an additional $10,000 added to the price of an average home without any improvement in materials or quality. Across Western Canada, mills embraced modernization and began shifting from raw exports to high V-value products, including engineered wood and premium timber components. This evolution reflected a broader industrial strategy. Move up the value chain and compete on innovation rather than volume. Each trade deal signed abroad carried symbolic weight, representing not only a contract, but a statement about Canada's new place in the global economy. The country that once relied almost entirely on American demand was now defining its own future through diversity, resilience, and strategic growth. Meanwhile, the U.S. construction sector was slipping into uncertainty. Lumber prices kept climbing, making it harder for families to afford homes and forcing builders to pull back on projects across the country. Housing development slowed or stopped altogether as domestic production failed to fill the widening supply gap. Contractors faced mounting costs, banks hesitated to finance new builds, and potential homeowners' watch prices climb out of reach. The dream of owning a home, once a cornerstone of American life, was now becoming harder to grasp. This evolution represented more than economic recovery. It signaled a shift in global influence. As the world grappled with unstable supply chains and rising geopolitical risks, the value of reliability grew. Canada's reputation as a dependable, sustainable supplier became one of its greatest assets. International partners began turning to Ottawa not only for raw materials, but for long-term stability in their housing and infrastructure plans. Dependability had quietly become a form of power, one that allowed Canada to expand its reach while others struggled to adapt. In Washington, the tone was beginning to change. Officials who once championed tariffs as a sign of strength now faced growing criticism from builders, unions, and economists who saw the strategy unraveling. Every measures designed to boost self-sufficiency were now making the system more fragile. High construction costs, labor shortages, and limited domestic production created a cycle that was difficult to escape. As frustration mounted, the debate shifted from protectionism to accountability, forcing policymakers to confront whether the approach had ever been sustainable. The goal of defending American industry had slowly turned into a struggle against its own consequences. Across the continent, the results of this experiment could be seen in every unfinished neighborhood and delayed infrastructure project. Housing shortages intensified. Trade routes were drawn. Canada, once seen as the smaller partner in the lumber equation, now held an undeniable upper hand. Its strategy of diversification had transformed a moment of economic pressure into a global opportunity. For the first time in decades, it was no longer defined by its connection to the U.S. housing market. It was carving out its own space in the world economy, guided by innovation, environmental awareness, and a growing network of international partners. This transformation reshaped how both nations viewed their roles. In Canada, investment in green technology and sustainable forestry turned the sector into a model of long-term planning. In the U.S., meanwhile, debates intensified over how to reverse course without admitting defeat. The irony of the situation was hard to ignore. Tariffs designed to limit Canada's leverage had instead boosted it. Each new contract signed in Tokyo, Berlin, or Seoul underscored how quickly global power can shift when strategy meets opportunity. And each stalled project in America reminded its citizens how deeply interconnected modern economies have become. But this trade dispute had evolved into a lesson about foresight for Canada. Adaptation became its greatest strength, for the U.S. resistance became its weakness. The divide between the two nations was no longer about timber alone. It reflected two entirely different responses to a changing world. One relied on adjustment and partnership, the other on isolation and control. And the consequences of those choices were unfolding in real time. The question now hangs over every boardroom, policy discussion, and construction site across North America. Did protectionism actually safeguard American interests? Or did it open the door for Canada's ascent? Because this story has always been about more than lumber or tariffs. It's about how economic power shifts when old strategies fail to keep pace with a globalized world. It's about what happens when the same walls built to defend a nation end up closing it in. One decision set off a chain reaction that redrew the map of North American trade, transforming allies into competitors and reshaping the balance of power for years to come. What do you think about all this? Tell us in the comments below. Before you leave, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.